This is The Jason Jones Show, powered by Mudhouse Media. Now, here's Jason Jones.
Aloha, everybody, and welcome to The Jason Jones Show. I am your host, Jason Jones, broadcasting from the beautiful hill country of Texas. And I want to be quick in this introduction. This is an important show, and we have a great guest. And I think this is the most important show we have ever done. I have COVID pneumonia. I don't feel great, but this show had to be done, and I wanted to get it done quickly. Our guest today is, we're going to use the name John. That's not his John. It's anonymous. He's a retired he's a former intelligence officer, served for 10 years in Iraq, several years in Afghanistan. He is fluent in the languages of the region and multiple dialects. Not only does he have a PhD in Arabic, but he's lived in the region for over 20 years. He has served our country, and he served the people of Iraq and Afghanistan. He's very knowledgeable on the ground and also from 30,000 feet as an academic, and as somebody who has a broad base of experience in the region over a long period of time. But not only that, he has been wounded seriously in Afghanistan. His blood is, when we were together in Iraq, we call him John. When I was in Iraq with John, an Iraqi official said to me that your buddy is Iraqi because there's two ways to be Iraqi. Either our sand is in your blood or your blood is in our sand, and his blood has been in our sand. He was wounded in Iraq. He was wounded in Afghanistan. He was wounded in another country. So, and these were not minor wounds. So he is an American, but he has put his life on the line not only for us, but also for the people of Afghanistan in Iraq. I wanted to talk to him to get a broad overview of Afghanistan. How did we get to this point of this great catastrophe, which I believe is one of the lowest points in the history of our nation, if not the lowest point? How did we get here? I asked him just 3 questions. I think these are the 3 questions that are to me, that were the most important questions that needed to be answered. And the show's about 90 minutes. I ask that you listen to the show. I know when you're done listening to the show, you're going to want to share with everyone you know, especially influencers. Share it with members of Congress. Share it with your pastors. Share it with your friends. Share it with veterans. And I want to make sure this show gets a large audience, because when you turn on the news, you're not getting a lot of information. You're getting sound bites run over and over and over again. And there are narratives that we can now begin to see that are being pushed through the media as they begin to influence us. We address what are some of the different influence campaigns that are being generated to form public opinion on this catastrophe. How are we going to see this catastrophe in a month? How are they trying to form our opinions? So I just want to get straight onto the interview with our guest, quote, John. This episode is being brought to you by the Vulnerable People Project, standing in solidarity with the vulnerable. We are not your traditional human rights organization. We are very serious in our commitment to defend the vulnerable from violence. Go to our website, thegreatcampaign.org, become a monthly supporter. This episode is also being brought to you by Mike Lindell's My Pillow, and he has a special on Giza Dream Sheets. I'm not going to go into this commercial too deeply for the show, because the show is that important. Just, Mike Lindell supports good causes. He supports this show. He has a great product. Go to mypillow.com. Use the code Jones when you click the radio listener square, and you will get deep discounts on everything. And there's a special on Giza Dream Sheets this month. All right. A lot of us are confused about what's going on in Afghanistan. A lot of us, all of us, I hope, are very angry. Well, this show, I promise you, when you are done with this 90 minutes, you are going to have a clarity on the issue of Afghanistan that would have taken you years of disciplined study to really come to this understanding of what's happening. So here we go with former intelligence officer John on Afghanistan on the Jason Jones Show. Aloha, John. Welcome to the Jason Jones Show.
Hi, Jason. Good to be here.
So, hey, brother, first of all, when you were on, John's not your real name because of the nature of your work. When you were on and we did the Iraq special, I received notes from members of Congress, people in the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, a lot of influential folks that said that was the best synopsis of Iraq that they have ever heard. So I'm grateful to have you on to talk about Afghanistan. I'm going to have three simple questions for you that I think all Americans are wanting answers for. The answers aren't simple, I know, but there'll be just three questions. But before we get there, can you give us a little bit about your work in Afghanistan and your knowledge of the country?
Sure. So, first of all, my expertise in Iraq and the Arab world is considerably greater than Afghanistan. I don't consider myself to be an Afghan expert. I spent nearly 10 years in Iraq. I did deploy to Afghanistan with the U.S. government and worked between there and Pakistan for several years. My last trip to Afghanistan was in 2018. So I would say that I'm not an expert, although I had significant experience on the ground.
There are a lot of experts on the mainstream media that have been to Afghanistan once or maybe never or read Wikipedia about Afghanistan that present themselves as experts. So I think it's quite humble of you to share that experience and say, I'm not an expert. So I would think compared to most folks we're hearing from, you're an expert on the region. Can you tell us what you did while you were there? Can you talk about that at all?
It was a mission for the Department of Defense, and the nature of the mission allowed me to work throughout the country. So I had a lot of different locations that I set up, which really gave me a good perspective on the country writ large, which is difficult for Afghanistan. My experience when I first went there was that Afghanistan didn't seem to be one country. It was like five countries. The East was so different from the North, which was so different from the West, which was so different from the South. And I mean, you have a country that's split with the world's second largest mountain range, the Hindu Kush, plus deserts and whatnot. So it's a country where you really don't have the connectivity between like states that you do in the United States. And I think that influenced the mission overall, because when I would visit one section of Afghanistan, for example, like Herat, Western Afghanistan, where the Italians were responsible for, it was like a totally different operation than Mazar-e-Sharif, the north, that the Germans were responsible for. So, and my impressions of Afghanistan, strategic impressions, going in, and I was lucky enough to take about 7 months to just learn the place and move all around the country and try to take in as much as possible. But my strategic observations on the mission at the time, and this would have been starting more than 10 years ago, was that it was an ad hoc mission. It was very disorganized, even compared to Iraq. In Iraq, there was one command and control mechanism, the U.S. Department of Defense. I think it was extremely organized while the U.S. forces were there, whereas Afghanistan was a NATO show and extremely disorganized. Coming from Iraq, it struck me as that, and no one was on the same page, and it was a mess. It was an overall mess
from the very beginning.
From my experience, yeah, my anecdotal experience. I mean, I can speak historically as to why it was a mess from the very beginning. I mean, we can go president by president, if that's useful.
Yeah, I want to do that. So I'll share with you my three questions, which are they're going to be the first question is just the American people have reacted spontaneously and passionately to the fall of Afghanistan, which has been significantly less tragic so far than what happened with the rise of ISIS in Iraq when it comes to loss of life. And so my first question, and you're the one person in the world I think that's best in a position to answer this because you served in both places. So my first question will be, why are Americans reacting differently to Afghanistan in a way that they didn't respond to Iraq? Well, that'll be the first question. Why are veterans so much more committed to getting their partners out of Afghanistan than I saw, at least in the media, than Iraq? The second question will simply be that Biden owns this. This is his catastrophe, but there have been catastrophes from the very beginning leading up to this epic tragedy. Maybe if we could do some of those landmarks. And then the third question will simply be, people are confused. I'm seeing journalists tweet, so-called area experts tweet. We're confused. And maybe just what would you want us to know? It's just citizens that I think all of us share a responsibility for broken promises. What should we know, and what is sort of our path to, how do we serve the people of Afghanistan going forward? So those would be the three questions. But the first question is, I have been taken aback and grateful to see the response of the American people, even coming from the left to the right. A passionate concern for the people of Afghanistan. You and I went to Iraq together. We worked hard trying to drum up concern for the people of Iraq, and it just seemed like an impossible task. Pope Francis himself never once mentioned the genocide of Christians in Iraq. And even I didn't see the outpouring of support for our partners in Iraq the way I'm seeing veterans. Just today, I was working with a Marine commander. I talked about this, trying to get his friend out, and he did. By the grace of God, he got his interpreter out. Mm-hmm. But so it seems different. How do you explain the difference in responses?
Okay, so there are a lot of questions there unfold. First off, I think the Iraq War was poisoned politically. It became a political football in Washington, and it ended up being condemned as the bad war, the unnecessary war, and Afghanistan was the good war. And so Iraq always had a nasty taint to it, and it was, a war you didn't talk about in polite company. I mean, people couldn't look at Iraq post invasion and post the eruption of the insurgency and say, okay, we're there. We need to do our best. We need to support our soldiers, Marines, airmen, etc. And put politics aside. We could never do that on Iraq. And so I think that's one thing, whereas Afghanistan was perceived to be the good war and the war of necessity. And I think a lot of that came in again in 2011. And it was very cynical maneuverings by foreign policy gadflies who wanted to ingratiate themselves with the Obama administration. And the Obama administration really, I think, campaigned on that we took our eyes off the ball and that Afghanistan is where we really need to be. But I think his actions showed that he himself was cynical about what, his true commitment to that. In terms of, okay, there's another tactical issue, or just a very nuts and bolts issue that differentiates Iraq and Afghanistan, and that's Iraq's, I would say, it was a considerably a much more dangerous place to operate. So Iraq was not a place where the press and NGOs could operate freely. Iraq's a very difficult place still to operate safely, whereas Afghanistan, until recently, especially Kabul, was a much safer place. So it was a place where NGOs could go. I mean, there was a 5-star Italian restaurant in Kabul. Same thing, a 5-star Lebanese restaurant, an incredible bar and nightclub. And I mean, unfortunately, this is one of the things that horrified me about Afghanistan. You had a lot of people, a lot of NGOs, and even civilian officials going into Afghanistan, and it was like play. It was like they were playing Dungeons and Dragons. They were in fantasy land. You know, they would put on their version of Afghan clothing, and it was an adventure. It was an adventure for them with little or no risk. And
these people were extras, and they were Bruce Lee, and it was a kung fu
yeah,
movie.
yeah.
And they got to go.
I mean,
there
the Afghans were extras, absolutely. And I can say for large numbers of the civilian bureaucracies who were there, I mean, they frankly, I mean, they partied incredibly, and this included, you know, many NGO workers and whatnot. So there was no seriousness about it, and they congregated largely in Kabul, and there was real fighting going on, and DOD, you know, was suffering terrible casualties, especially from the Obama administration with the two surges in troops. That's when we suffered our largest casualties in the war, and the Afghan security forces and Afghan civilians were fighting a very, very real, vicious war. But meanwhile, in Kabul, you had this la-la land. And unfortunately, a lot of these people, especially in the civilian bureaucracy, were your decision makers or were advisors to decision makers who were responsible for Afghan policy and what the end state of that country was supposed to be. And that's what's called nation building. And I mean, that failed horrifically. And
something you said to me.
Tremendous advantage. Yeah, sorry.
Well, no, something you said to me yesterday as you're talking about Kabul, comparing it to the rest of the country. You said, you know, there are young men that have worked for us that are 25 years old that were 5 when we invaded, and that's all they've ever known. So they've lived in that quote unquote la la land.
Yeah.
And it's evaporated, and now their lives are in jeopardy. You know, to me, what says it all? The first NGO into Afghanistan after the invasion was Planned Parenthood. And in June, we closed out our time in Afghanistan with the rainbow flag hanging in front of the embassy. Today, I saw a photograph of Afghan women and children being shoved up against a wall by Taliban with AK-47s. And the wall they were being shoved up against was postered, I sent it to you, plastered with UN posters that said things like, we can fight climate change, climate equality, educate on global warming. And so we see real human beings being shoved up against a wall by men with rifles. And the wall is a wall of Western virtue signaling bullshit. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they were concerned more with petty corruption than they were concerned with the frankly, the deaths of thousands of people. I mean, in terms of the initiatives that were put forth, and I mean, it was almost Stalinistic. The death of a single person is a tragedy, but the death of a million is a statistic. I mean, I'm sorry to speak in such stark terms, but those were my feelings. Those were my reactions to it. I want to answer the last question, or the third question, which was, why does it seem like U.S. service personnel are more on the ball at helping out their Afghan counterparts in comparison to helping out their Iraqi counterparts? I don't think that's true. I think American service personnel have done their utmost to help out their Iraqi counterparts, their interpreters, their translators, working through a horrific bureaucratic system meaning our immigration system. So I don't think that's the
so
case.
Maybe it's just they've learned, from Iraq, and they've just been much better at mobilizing and getting into the mainstream media. There was one gentleman that was on MSNBC, that just gave an epic takedown of Biden and to MSNBC's response to Biden's comments on what's going on in Afghanistan. It was just epic. And so I'm noticing that these veterans, they're on all the news channels. So that makes a lot of sense. It's not that they've learned a lot. They've been here before, and they're bringing that knowledge forward to be more effective.
Yeah, I mean, I was in Iraq when ISIS invaded Mosul, and I was very close. I was very close to Mosul at the time, and I can tell you there were virtually no Westerners or Western media outlets there as well. Whereas in Kabul, there is, I mean, everybody, pretty much all of the large Western networks have been there. So you didn't get to see the same coverage of Mosul falling. It was in Iraq, you didn't see, and you don't see the same amount of Westerners that were in Afghanistan congregating in Kabul. So I think that's another aspect as well.
Okay, well, I really appreciate that answer. Do you think 9/11's connection to Afghanistan maybe also has a lot to do with the American public's sort of natural, visceral response to what's going on?
I think I think it's connected, but here's the problem with that. Biden said, we went to Afghanistan almost 20 years ago with clear goals. Get those who attacked us on September 11, 2001, and make sure Al-Qaeda could not use Afghanistan as a base from which to attack us again. We did that a decade ago. Our mission was never supposed to be nation building. Here's a problem with that. Al-Qaeda is in Afghanistan. And its alliance with the Taliban is as strong as ever. So the head of Al-Qaeda, the one who replaced Osama bin Laden, Ayman al-Zawahiri, has sworn a blood oath to the head of the Taliban, Haibatullah Akhundzada, and the Taliban's number 2, Sirajuddin Haqqani, the deputy commander of the Taliban. There are extensive intelligence dossiers on him, and the UN of all organizations has put forth that he's pure Al-Qaeda. And the UN as well, and the UN is not known to be a particularly forward-leaning organization. The UN, in the UN report, an intelligence report, they released that Al-Qaeda is present in 10 to 15 of Afghanistan's 34 provinces. So, I mean, the basic mission, the initial mission in Afghanistan to eliminate the Taliban and to eliminate Al-Qaeda was a failure. I mean, neither the Taliban nor Al-Qaeda were destroyed. They were disrupted, Jason. The only success that we can claim was the toppling of the Taliban government, and now they're back. Some senior Taliban and Al-Qaeda were taken out, but that was a drop in the bucket. We could have, or we should have deployed every division that we had in the weeks following 9/11, sent them into Afghanistan. Bin Laden, the Taliban were surrounded in Tora Bora and liquidated them. And we failed to use decisive, overwhelming force. And we would have taken out all of the Al Qaeda networks that are spread throughout the world. And Al Qaeda actually helped the Taliban make a recovery, and the resurgence of which we're witnessing right now. So it's not just the Taliban taking Afghanistan, it's Al Qaeda.
So today the Taliban said they promised that Afghanistan will never be used as a base to attack the United States.
Sure. And their fingers are crossed, they've crossed their fingers behind their backs. Yeah, the Taliban issue fatwas all the time, they also claim that they would never invade cities. They also claim that in a fatwa that they would never take Kabul. So
today they promised to be protectors of women's rights as well. So today they announced that they're going to be the protectors of women's rights.
Right.
And Afghanistan will be never used as a base to attack the United States, while reports are coming in of women being killed across Afghanistan just today and yesterday.
Yeah, and women and the Taliban going to villages and wanting lists of women, unmarried and widows, to marry off the Taliban commanders. Yeah.
Okay, so here we are. We're at this catastrophe. Biden is trying to place the blame on Trump. Biden owns this. No one knows what Trump would have done. He made a mistake.
A lot of people own this, but yeah.
So that's the question. There's been a series of very big mistakes. Give us the big landmarks as we're going back. Maybe 2 or 3. We don't have to do. If think of the 2 or 3 big points of failure that brought us to this epic catastrophe.
I'd have to go president by president, to be fair.
Okay.
So start with Clinton. His administration didn't take Al Qaeda seriously, despite the bombing of 2 U.S. embassies in the USS Cole. Clinton waffled on multiple opportunities to target Bin Laden. Al Qaeda threat manifested during Clinton's watch, which led to 9/11. Bush failed to take out Al Qaeda and the Taliban. Obama said that he was going to commit to Afghanistan. The Europeans failed in their role to build up the Afghan security forces. Obama decided that he was going to do that. So he began a surge, one in February and one in December, that took our forces up to about 100,000.
What
but
year
at the
was
same
that?
time,
What year was that?
This is 2009, so
Okay.
February 2009, December 2009. But at the same time, he set a public drawdown timetable of July 2011. So announced the Taliban that that this surge would only be for 18 months. By 2010, 2011, the Obama administration desperately started seeking a peace deal with the Taliban. Those talks ended in a fiasco because by 2012, I think Obama wanted to say he brought the Iraq War to an end in 2011, and he brought the Afghan War to an end by 2012. That failed miserably. Peace talks ended in 2013. Then in 2014, NATO and the U.S. declared an end to combat operations. And the thing is, you really, it pains me to say this, but you have to blame U.S. general after U.S. general who were expected to basically lie and say that the Afghan military had stood up on its own 2 feet and was ready. So we've had 18 combatant commanders in Afghanistan, I think, and the whole idea that Afghan security forces are 300,000 strong, when there were so many problems with Afghan security forces. But even that being said, Afghan security forces put up a hell of a fight, and from 2014 took about 50,000 casualties. So combat operations ended for American forces, and we suffered relatively no casualties. I mean, from 2014, we suffer in the past 18 months. The United States didn't lose one member of our armed forces, but the Taliban just wore away at them.
But the Afghan forces have suffered a lot of losses, right, in the past 18 months. So there's a narrative being spun that they haven't been fighting, but they have been fighting.
No, well, I mean, on this one, you have to take it to the Trump administration at this point. So Trump signs off on a 2017 strategy for victory, but it was modest, and it was like a last-ditch effort to prop up the Afghans, get tough on Afghanistan, but that was abandoned. And Trump and Pompeo picked up on Obama's peace plan, peace process with the Taliban, and that really undercut the Afghans, because they weren't even part of the negotiations on that. And you had Mattis saying that we do look forward to victory in Afghanistan, but not a military victory, and that the Taliban's peace offer without preconditions was genuine. I think DOD even put out a statement on that, but they didn't put the original in Pashto, the language of the Taliban, the dominant language. But it was this: we had genuine peace with the Afghans. So if you're an Afghan commander and you see the Secretary of State, so we had with the Trump administration, we had a shift where they went so far as Trump and Pompeo saying that the Taliban would be our partner in the war on terror, and this was we threw the Afghan government under the bus. And I mean, if you were an Afghan military commander and saw us negotiating with the Taliban, I mean, you would have been so demoralized. Yeah, I mean, and I would ask the question, I mean, would you support your government? I mean, would you fight against the Taliban, seeing this happen? And while the Afghan military was taking like thousands of casualties, the U.S. just proceeded on this feckless diplomacy. I mean, Trump invited the Taliban to Camp David a month after there was video of them celebrating 9/11. I mean, it was bad. It was really bad. I mean, there's a lot of blame to go around. To say what would happen with the second term, I don't know. So and then we have Biden again, who said in July, famously that which was corroborated by Chairman Mike Milley, that the Afghan military had 30,000 strong force, which is really a mythical figure, and which collapsed 3 weeks later. There was a moment during a press conference where Biden was asked, trying to think of the wording of it. but there was a press conference where Biden was asked
If Kabul could ever
about an
fall.
intelligence. I'm sorry.
If Kabul would ever fall.
Yeah. So Biden was asked in a press conference about the intelligence community estimates about the Afghan government falling, and he said, "No, that's absolutely not true. That's patently untrue." He said twice. And you had, I mean, in terms of intelligence failures, I mean, this is as bad as 9/11. This is as bad as the Tet Offensive. I mean, what the what the Taliban was able to do, all under our noses, was plan, organize, recruit, deploy forces for this offensive, pre-position arms all throughout the country, under the nose of the U.S., NATO, our intelligence agencies, all of that. What I would say, Jason, the net of all of this is, where's the accountability? I mean, where is the accountability for these gross failures? I mean, if someone working a regular job, if they failed at something that was minuscule compared to this, they would be fired. I mean, and
their cash register is missing $100. You work at a restaurant, you're gone. You're fired.
Yeah,
you're done.
Yeah, I mean, how many people were fired for failing to forecast, even to a small degree, ISIS or the Iraqi insurgency, or even Iran's clandestine military nuclear program?
They
were promoted.
Yeah,
they were not only promoted, right? These agencies' budgets ballooned. So you need accountability for gross incompetence. I mean, that's what the American people need, or this is going to keep happening. And I mean, these are the same agencies tasked with protecting the home front. So if we have this level of gross incompetence in Afghanistan against rural country bumpkin infantrymen, and I'm referring to the Taliban, I mean, what happens when we're...
I ask people how many Taliban there are. They go, there's like 3 million, 4 million. How many members of the Taliban are there really?
It's hard to say. I mean, it's hard to say. The Taliban's a rural phenomenon. So, I mean, I've never bought the Department of Defense's figure that the president cites as well, that there's 75,000. I mean, I think they're in the hundreds of thousands. I mean, let's say 150,000. Let's double that.
And they're armed with Cold War era AK-47s.
Yeah, they're infantrymen. Well, now they're armed with heavy. They're armed with heavy weaponry.
Thanks to the United States.
Yeah, I mean, they're in control of Black Hawk helicopters as well.
Drones. They've captured drones.
Drones, absolutely. I don't know if they can fly the Black Hawks, but yeah. And the thing is with Afghanistan that we have to be really forewarned about is that a Taliban, and I'm going to say Al Qaeda victory, an American defeat in Afghanistan, is going to inspire our enemies abroad. Not just China and Russia and Iran, but terrorist networks throughout the world, in the same way that the Soviet defeat in Afghanistan inspired ultimately and created Al Qaeda.
Well, on that note, a friend of ours that we were with together in Washington, D.C. a couple weeks ago from Nigeria messaged me yesterday that she's sheltering in place with her daughter because Islamists have been in her village killing people, and that the government has ordered a curfew. So we're already seeing extremists being emboldened in Africa from what's happening in Afghanistan.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one thing that I failed to touch on about the Biden administration, um, as of this year, so the Afghan security forces received air support and intelligence support from the U.S. As of this year, that largely stopped, and those were two capabilities that allowed the Afghan security forces a chance of keeping the Taliban in check. And when we withdrew air support and intelligence for the South Vietnamese army, the North was able to invade successfully. And it was something that we didn't have to do. I mean, it was almost that we guaranteed their collapse.
Well, we built a military that was dependent on
exactly.
our air support intelligence. We built a military that could only fight effectively using our strategies, our tactics,
absolutely,
our air-land doctrine.
Absolutely.
We removed the air, and their whole system was built on our air-land doctrine.
That's exactly right. That's the same thing that happened in Iraq. There's a direct parallel there. There's a direct, and while that was in place, you had a status quo stalemate. So you basically had a situation in which the Taliban couldn't take over most of Afghanistan and defeat the Afghan government, and the government couldn't outright defeat the Taliban. And to be frank, the U.S. itself is not able to defeat terrorist networks in virtually all of the countries in which we're engaged. This is not like the Second World War. People talk about this in military terms. I'm not a great military expert, but they talk about this as if there's a clear winner and a clear loser. This is a war of terrorism. This is like a war meeting the most violent crime imaginable that must continually be combated. And I'll say that there's no clear winner in these things. It continues, but there are clear losers, and that's when you have another 9/11, you have another 7/7 in the UK or Madrid, Paris, etc. What the status quo in Afghanistan allowed us to do with minimal cost in DoD terms, meaning, I mean, we didn't lose a single person in 18 months, and even in budgetary terms, with the Pentagon's $700 billion budget, I think the strategic benefits of Afghanistan were absolutely worth it. In preventing another terrorist haven, in having a base of operations to be able to go after terrorist networks. And I mean, how do people feel about Al Qaeda being back and having a government with heavy weaponry
John, most Americans don't know. This is our media. They run the same clips over and over. There's no in-depth analysis. They have these talking heads on for the most part.
Right.
It's very clear that their real level of knowledge, it's very shallow. And you hear the same talking points repeated over and over. And then you can see these narratives. Now they're blaming the Afghans. You can see these narratives. Most Americans don't understand that we spent $2 trillion in 20 years training them to fight like us. And then we remove our command and control. We remove our air power. We remove our intelligence. And it doesn't work that way. And they can't succeed.
I think the figure is, I think we spent $138 billion directly on training Afghan security forces. The other costs and expenses, I mean, the amount was staggering. But I think that's a more precise number. But let's we say that, we can't have a forever war. or we can't stay there. We can't remain there forever. What about South Korea? We have almost 30,000 troops still in South Korea. Why? Because they can't handle the North Korean threat. Because if we pulled out, North Korea would invade. What's the difference between Afghanistan and South Korea? I mean, why do we still? The Korean War ended in 1953, right? I mean, why do we still have 30,000 troops? By the argument that's being used that we can't be there forever. I mean, we should apply that argument as well to South Korea. We should apply that to the uncountable. I can't count the amount of bases that we have throughout the world. Here's an interesting factoid. Our European allies at NATO wanted to keep up to 8,000 of their forces in Afghanistan for their national security interests. They were more bullish than we were, and we would keep 2,500. But our government was more feckless than the Europeans. And our President Biden presented a false choice in saying that we would be staying there, and that would mean dramatically expanding troop levels. No one was talking about that. It was to keep 2,500 Americans there, combine that with NATO forces, with intel and air support, and you would have had a Korea-like situation. I know it's not the best analogy, but I think it's very instructive to look at a country that we left 70 years ago.
Well, John, it's an instructive analogy, but I think more so than that, it should reveal to us. And I despise war. I'm not eager for regime change wars, but we have to ask ourselves, when all of a sudden we're mouthing, it's time to get out of Afghanistan. We've been there too long. We're not, we've made our commitment. We're saying that, but we're not addressing we're still in South Korea. Our bases are all over Europe. We have a base in Okinawa. We are in, how many countries are we in?
We're all over Central Asia, the neighborhood of Afghanistan as well.
Right. So yeah. So we have to ask ourselves, why are we mouthing these talking points? Well, we're being influenced by campaigns designed to get us to support this decision. And
yeah, that's absolutely true. That's absolutely true.
So I think that's what's most destructive about it, right? We have to, why aren't we saying let's get out of South Korea? Why are we saying let's get out of Europe? Why are we in Sicily? Why are we in Italy? Why are we not asking this question? And I'm not saying we should come back from those places. I am for peace, and I believe that we have peace through strength. And we shouldn't, the world is not a utopia. Again, I'm not for gallivanting around the world doing regime change wars, unnecessary regime change wars. But with Afghanistan specifically, I remember very clearly the promises we made those people. Mm-hmm. Promises that we forgot we made and never meant to keep. And so I think that we as a people need a real national recollection. We need to do a recollection of our conscience. We need to examine our conscience and ask ourselves, what kind of people have we become? Maybe we're still in South Korea. Maybe we're still in Europe, because those roots were planted when we were a people that made commitments and meant them. And those roots are so deep, they're hard to pull out. But when our generations have planted seeds, they're really easy to uproot. When our generations make promises, we've actually never meant to keep them.
Yeah, for me, the big thing is accountability for grotesque incompetence. Accountability, lessons learned. How could this have happened? How could this has been 20 years in the making. How could this have happened? And the American taxpayers deserve this. The American taxpayers are footing the bill for this, and this is the failure of our government. This is the failure of our bureaucracy. This is the failure, and I don't by no means am I criticizing any service member who deployed to Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. I mean, God bless those people. But what I'm getting at is there
Isn't it interesting?
there needs to be accountability for the 18 generals, combatant commanders who and members of intelligence agencies who filtered intelligence to fit political narratives, and that goes all the way up to the president. And we can't. I can't stress enough. This was one of the greatest intelligence failures in our history. And I mean, we cannot afford anything close to this domestically. The loss of life, the destruction that could occur as a result of this, and we're dealing with the same governmental agencies that prosecuted this war. We're relying on them to defend us, and that scares the hell out of me. Having been a member of this quote unquote community, it scares the hell out of me. And I can tell you the line that, well, we know what's going on. It's just classified. That's utter BS. That's utter BS. That's something that people hide behind.
Well, now we know they did. They had no clue. They either had no clue of what was going on, no will to communicate it, or they lacked the ability to communicate it to decision makers. That's it. Either they didn't know, they knew and they didn't say, or they knew and they could not communicate clearly the consequences of Biden's decision and all these previous failures. It's only one of those three.
Right. In late July, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, said the Afghans had the capability to keep their government in power, basically. And then over the course of weeks, it was whittled down to 1 year that the government could hold out. And then that quickly shifted to 6 months. And then within a week, 60 to 90 days. And then within a couple of days, it was a week, if not a couple of days before it would fall.
Well, you knew ahead of time because as I was working to get people out, you were exactly right on how many days we had.
Yeah.
They were telling us 6 months. You said you've got less than 10 days.
I was watching the districts and provinces fall, and I know a little bit. I know enough about the country to know what the Taliban needed to take over, to for example to take Kabul. I knew that the Taliban had control of almost all the major highways, the border crossings and whatnot. They were much smarter than they were in the mid-'90s when they were fighting the Northern Alliance. They knew what they were doing. And
and thanks to you telling me that, it saved a woman's life because they were kind of dilly-dallying. And a decision was made they wanted to do something 24 hours later. And because of what you told me, they did it that day. And because they did it that day, they got out right under the wire. So the intelligence matters. It matters. And accurate reporting. And communicating information.
Intelligence is life and death. Intelligence is life and death. And after an intelligence failure of this magnitude, if something isn't done, I fear some catastrophic things over the horizon.
All right. So here's the last question, and then you can add anything you want. But this morning, my wife she was crying. She said, "Honey, in the past year, I lost my father to COVID. We had to move. We've all had COVID this month. I have COVID pneumonia now. And she listed a litany of just things we've suffered. And she said, it's not affected me. I've not been depressed. In the past couple of days watching what's happening in Afghanistan, I've never felt this much despair. And I'm hearing this from so many people, veterans
Yeah.
wives, veterans families. And I'm glad. It shows to me that there is a part of us left. There are those of us left who have a sense of shame and responsibility. But here we
Yeah.
are, we're just citizens. My wife homeschools my 5 children, yet she is watching the television. And she said, why do I feel so much shame over this? Why
Yeah.
am I despairing over this? And I said, well, Socrates said, it's better to suffer injustice than to commit one. And so your father died of the CCP virus. We're sick. We had to move from Hawaii to Texas because of the lockdowns for me to continue to do my work and disrupt my family. All this, you could say we've suffered. But you feel that you, in some small way, and she's a New Yorker, 9/11 impacted her. She lost friends in the towers. I said, you feel personally responsible for the suffering of the Afghan people. I feel that way.
Yeah.
I don't think the people responsible for the policies that have abandoned these folks feel anything at all. I really don't. I don't. So what about?
We have.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Please, I apologize.
No. So what would you say to those of us? We're just regular old citizens, but we feel a profound sense of shame and ignobility, and we want to do something. What do? We do congressional committees, investigations. What do we bang the drums for? What do we do? I just found out they're bringing some Afghan interpreters near me. They're going to be processed. I'm going to find out best how I can volunteer and serve those men. But yeah, what would you tell us? What would you say to us with your experience?
One thing I would say, I've traveled and lived in many countries around the world, and I would say Americans, the American people, they're a great people. They're really a great people. Our political class is pretty awful, and I agree with you. I overwhelmingly there is a lack of compassion and even humanity for the sufferings that go on as a result of launching needless military operations or withdrawing and leaving our friends and allies, to their fates, which is death. But I would say the American people, I feel ashamed to be American right now. And I can tell you that the mission that I did in Afghanistan nearly broke me. It was so difficult. But I still feel ashamed for my country, and I think only good people feel like that. I think only good people with a conscience. I think we need to demand accountability from our government, and I think every American who cares not only about our Afghan friends and the people of Afghanistan or people of Iraq or people anywhere in the world where the U.S. has had an impact on a given society. I think they need to write their congressmen and women and demand accountability. Demand accountability from our governmental agencies who are ultimately responsible for our foreign policy and for operationalizing our foreign policy and our foreign policy initiatives. I think we need accountability down to the agency level. I think that there should be public hearings on this. I think that and I will never badmouth our military. We have a wonderful military. They're the greatest Americans that we have. But I think that the American military leadership as well, who presided over 20 years of this debacle in Afghanistan have to be called to the carpet as to what went wrong, and in some cases, they may not be culpable. I would like to know from them. I'd like to hear from them how they were pressured by administrations to give the right answers, to make sure that their intelligence was in line with political agendas. This is a huge point of inflection for our country, as far as I see it. And if we gloss over this, and if we forget about Afghanistan a month from, 2 weeks from now, a month from now, 6 months from now, not only will that be a tragedy and a loss, that will not augur well for our future. And once again, if we don't do something in the here and now, which is call for accountability, extreme accountability on this, we're going to see catastrophic things, I would forecast, over the horizon. And I think people should be really concerned about that. And I think while we have time, we need to do something in the here and now. And I really, it pains me to think that Afghanistan can be swept under the rug within a week or 2 weeks by the media, and we will have moved on to something else. And I think the media needs to be held accountable for Afghanistan as well. That's what I would say.
That's something that's, the intelligence failure has become obvious, but the failure of our media, I think these are canary in the coal mine moments for us to realize that we can't count on our media. We can't count on our intelligence community. We can't count on our elected officials to dig down and dig deep to try to really understand the information that they're being presented in these subcommittees. And we can't count on, traditionally, we would look to, I'm Catholic, we would look to the hierarchy of the Catholic Church and the USCCB to be engaged thoughtfully in matters that are this important. That's silly to even consider. So then it just comes down to us. You're listening to this show. This is not your normal audience. It's not your normal tribe. It's growing. It's quite big. I think we're going to be the #1 podcast downloaded in New Zealand this week. I'm looking at the numbers. It's just around the world as well. But that we, each and every one of us, has to just take responsibility. And this is, John, what I'm hopeful about. I really do believe that these might be paddles on the heart of the body politic, and it might get that heart beating again.
Yeah, when I use the term point of inflection, that's what I'm referring to. And I think if right now enough Americans can contact their elected officials, and to the point where there's just such a groundswell that this cannot be ignored, and I think that there has to be a very public inquiry into this, where the leadership responsible, and we're not going to get ex-presidents, of course, but the leadership responsible for this throughout the years need to come in and need to testify, need to say what went wrong, why it went wrong, and this can be. I think this needs to be a monumental learning experience for our country, that hopefully could influence the rebuilding or reconstitution, of our foreign policy establishment and aspects of our military. It's not going to get any better. The world's not getting safer. And now the United States, our credibility as allies and our credibility in terms of will, which means our deterrence has to be at, I can't say an all-time low, but in recent memory at an all-time low, which it invites attacks from all kinds of players, from transnational terrorist networks to nation states. We look weak. We look feckless. We look cynical. We look, and I think the first responsibility of our political class is to protect the American people, to protect the homeland, and
maybe this can be an end to the woke military. My son, when he was in Syria, and they were nose to nose with ISIS, every couple of weeks he was having to go to gender and these sensitivity classes in Syria.
Right.
And when you have a woke military, that leads to, and you have generals who are politicians, and they're kissing up instead of thinking about their soldiers, their Marines, their airmen, their sailors. The mission gets muddled, and it leads to Afghan women being pushed up against a wall and shot. That's your gender sensitivity right there. It leads to homosexuals in Kabul having walls pushed on them. There's your gender sensitivity for you right there. Let the military do its job. Don't take it as it's not a public school where you get to come in and, push ideology on them. They should be trained to do their job. They should be supported in their job and their mission. It's a big enough job. There's no bigger job in the world. There's no more challenging mission in the world. They don't have the bandwidth for your silliness. Move along. So maybe, hopefully, this is the end to the woke nonsense as well. I pray.
Well, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff defended what you're saying, and the Secretary of Defense has presided over this administration's pushing these policies within the military, and they've just failed at their primary task in Afghanistan catastrophically. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, if he didn't believe in this wokeism, he could have stepped down. The same thing with the Secretary of Defense. I'll ask now, how many people are going to step down as a result of the collapse of Afghanistan? How many people will step down? I'll say virtually none, if none.
I say none. And then here's another question. How many former combatant commanders will step forward and say, we need to talk, Congress. We need to get together. They shouldn't need to be called, right? They should be stepping forward saying, I was a part of this catastrophe. Let's figure out what we're wrong. This is what somebody with nobility would do. Somebody with dignity would do. Someone that was thoughtful to the history of this republic would do. The future of this republic would do. How many do you think will step forward? I suspect none, and I think instead they're going to write memoirs and spin history to justify themselves. They're probably already all racing out to hire ghostwriters to rewrite history, to carve a little safe space for them.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, when you get out, when you retire as certainly a combatant commander, but a senior flag rank officer, general or admiral, I mean, it's almost inevitable that you will become a very wealthy person. The same thing holds for people who serve in the intelligence community at higher ranks. So these are people that have served and now are very wealthy people as a result of the service and the careers that American taxpayers paid for. Um, so they're unaffected by this.
Well, and that's why I greatly admire you, because you could have been one of those guys that leveraged your career for wealth. And unfortunately, because the nature of your work, we can't say who you are, really what you've done or what you're doing now, other than I can say that you have leveraged all of that to serve the people we made promises to. And you have, I don't want to speak out of turn, but you have given a lot in many countries. And I would just wish we had more men and women that make it into those positions that recognize that the privilege of service where they get to serve puts upon them a duty that I see that you recognize. So, be careful what you ask for. When you get in certain positions, then that privilege burdens you with a duty for the rest of your life that you can't ever escape. And to think that they look at this, instead, they're looking at opportunities. Which boards can I get on? Which speakers bureau can I become a member of? What size book deal can I become? Can I get? Instead of, I was part of a I was part of a community that made a promise that we have really been failing to keep. How do I leverage all of this experience, knowledge, and relationships to continue the mission in the private sector to serve these communities? I've seen that in very few people.
Well, I'm grateful for that. I have to say that the people that have to be honored the most are those who paid the ultimate price, gave the ultimate sacrifice in their lives, and the families of these people who lost their sons and daughters or husbands, wives. And keep this in mind, this figure. To date, 60,000 service men and women have committed suicide, those who served in the Iraq and Afghan war, which is greater than the death toll of the entire Vietnam War. So keep in mind the sacrifices of these people and the hundreds of thousands of other people who have been maimed and who have been horribly scarred psychologically, fighting the good fight because they're great Americans, they're great patriots, and they didn't do it for the money. They did it for love of their country. And this goes back to me saying that Americans are great people. Americans are really good-hearted, great people. And that's the one thing that gives me hope. Regular Americans, not our political class, by no means, not the establishment, not our so-called elite, but the American people.
This might seem
mm-hmm.
seem like a strange analogy, but we've talked about this a lot. I think the one mistake we have made as a people, it's sort of like Catholic parents in the 70s who sent their children to diocesan Catholic schools or Jesuit schools because they just knew they were going to go and get a good education and they weren't really paying attention. And I think that we had this trust in our intelligence community. We had this trust in our elected officials. We had this trust in NGOs and church leadership. And we just kind of thought, I remember moving to D.C. from college and thinking I was going to run into powerful and influential people from prominent families that had great educations that were going to be ordering their lives into the service of the vulnerable. And, you quickly get that illusion smacked away. I think that's what we need to understand, that I don't think any other country in the world that would have been involved in an epic catastrophe like this, the people would feel so deeply and be so angry as the American people are. And that is beautiful. I'm grateful for that. But we need to take that and harness that and say, now we need to pay attention. We can no longer imagine that the hen house is being guarded. There is no one guarding the hen house. And so we all have to be more disciplined and more engaged for the good of this country.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And
well, brother, I promised I would only take 30 to 60 minutes, and I went over by 10.
No problem. No problem.
And
do you have any more questions?
I don't. I don't. I want to say this. I know you don't like doing these shows, but this has been the most informed for me personally, and I've been spending a lot of time and trying to gather a lot of information. Just talking to you this hour has given me more information than I could have gathered in weeks. So I'm so grateful for you coming on and wanting to share this. You can come on, as you know, you can come on anytime. And is there anything you want to say that I didn't ask?
Yeah, I want to add one thing. So I talked about that this is basically, in my view, a Taliban al-Qaeda victory in Afghanistan. I want to mention Iran in parting, because the Obama administration pushed so hard for an Iran deal, and I understand the current Biden administration is in lockstep with that, and the American people should keep in mind. So keep that on the radar, and also keep in mind that Iran has been providing intelligence and material support to the Taliban throughout the war, to target American forces. And there have been leaked U.S. intelligence reports that Iran has even paid bounties to the Taliban for targeting American troops in Afghanistan. And that tracks with the hundreds of Americans who ultimately died as a result of Iranian operations in Iraq, which you were not allowed to talk about or admit to during the greater part of the Iraq War. And this was despite the fact that Iran was industrially producing IEDs, so roadside bombs, and ESPs, which are a stronger version of them, to target American soldiers, Marines, and Iraqi forces in Iraq. And this is the country that we want to negotiate with, and have this is the next country slotted for us to have peace talks with. I want the listeners to keep this on the radar and think about the context that I just provided.
And then when you put that in with Russia having a very open and aggressive Eastern strategy, we're looking at an axis of evil that could run from Moscow through Iran, through Pakistan, through Afghanistan, through China.
Yeah, and we just gave up a critical base in Afghanistan for counterterrorism. Yeah, we just gave it up. So, Iran wanted us out of their eastern border, Afghanistan. They want us out of their western border, Iraq. So I expect now that they will intensify their strikes on American military elements there. And I just saw a video of an Iranian-backed Iraqi militia saying that they're going to begin targeting the American military in Jordan, and that this will be a region-wide campaign. So this goes back to what the fall of Afghanistan does, and how it emboldens our enemies. And this is the fallout. This is an example of the fallout from it. But the point that I'm trying to make is, how can we negotiate with a government that has killed our soldiers and Marines? How can we do that? How can we enter into peace talks with the Taliban, whose number two is Al Qaeda, and who Al Qaeda has sworn a blood oath to.
And what a grave scandal that, unless you listen to the Jason Jones Show, you're not going to know that. MSNBC, yeah. CNBC, Fox probably will not even talk about it. It's just not going to be talked about. It's just going to be glossed over, swept under the rug.
Sure. And I'm just touching, not superficially, but I'm not going that into depth on these things.
Look, I want to go into depth with you. I'd like to talk about Iran more, because people think we couldn't wrestle Afghanistan and people think that we can handle Iran, that might be a whole other show. That the beast that Iran is.
The Iranian regime is,
the people are the best. We've talked about that.
They're the best.
Share that about the polls of the Iranian public opinion in the Middle East towards America.
Iranian people consistently have the highest opinion polls of the United States in the Middle East. Anecdotally, Americans that I know that have gone to Iran on vacation say that they were treated so wonderfully by the Iranian people, and I have a tremendous amount of Iranian friends in Iran and outside of Iran, and they're just terrific people, natural friends with Americans. They just have a horrible regime.
Iran is going to be my top 2 or 3 countries in the world I'd want to go to. Unfortunately, I was a producer on The Stoning of Soraya M. And my name was the first name when the credits rolled. And my producing partner said, thank you why did you give me such a prominent credit? He's like, so they come after you first. And they did. I was in Iranian newspapers and called all sorts of horrible things. But I don't think I'll be going to Iran anytime soon, as much as I really would like to go. And I made a movie in Farsi. Like we could do a screening or something, but I think we're going to have to wait for a regime change there before that happens.
Our press hasn't, our American press hasn't reported on the atrocities the recent atrocities that the Iranian regime has inflicted on the Iranian people, where 4,000 were slaughtered in protests in 2019, and people are continuing to be slaughtered over issues like water shortages and abject poverty and everything that you can imagine. It's just not politically correct if you're an American media outlet to report those things.
No, and we can keep feeding people social justice junk food so they feel full. There's no reason to really engage in really tragic, serious issues that take thoughtfulness and fortitude to engage in. So we'll just do BLM, Antifa. We'll talk about Governor Cuomo all day and his misdeeds. We're not going to talk about him killing elderly people. That's too much. But we will talk about him, sexual scandals. We love that. We love sexual scandals. But when it comes to real tragedies in the world, we look away. And our media looks away. I think the American people would like to know, but they don't know what they don't know. They wake up every morning, they take their kids to school, they go to work, their boss is breathing down their neck, they've missed paychecks because of COVID, they're 2 mortgages behind, they're struggling, and they turn on the news, they're looking for information, and then they get global warming is the greatest cause of problems in the world. They're never going to know that there's a water shortage, and if they do, they'll say global warming is causing, the 4,000 people died in Iran because of global warming, because of the water shortage was caused by climate change, and that's why the regime killed the 4,000 people. That's how they. If you ever hear that story, I think that's how it would be presented.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the American people have genuinely, in genuine terms, I mean, every day enter into from their end an honest social contract with their government, that they defer to the government on all issues that the government is supposed to be responsible for, including homeland security and national defense, and they trust their government. And it's not on the American people that they don't know about these issues, and the same thing applies to the media. But that's the media. I think by now it's become pretty obvious how warped mainstream media is. I think the American people have woken up to that, and I think the American people are much smarter than the media and the progressive establishment class would give them credit for. They're much smarter. The American people are much much more savvy than they're given credit for, and they're operating under good faith, whereas the other side isn't, which puts them at a tremendous disadvantage. So, and they're trying to row the boat, like you said. Their boss is breathing down their necks, and they're trying to survive. They're trying to get their to pay their mortgage or pay their rent on their apartment, to put food on the table, to get their kids to school, to get their car into the shop. So.
By the way, all of this we're talking about, my family did today. My wife had to get the car to the shop. I'm fighting COVID. We got homeschool starting, and this is what we do. The good news is we got alternative media. We got the Jason Jones Show. We have all these podcasts. You can watch Al Jazeera. You can watch these alternative news programs from around the world. You can also, I use Flipboard, and I take topics and issues and places like Afghanistan, Iraq, pro-life, and every news story in the world comes right into my feed every day on that issue, aggregated.
Yeah.
I get, and every hashtag I want gets fed into my Flipboard. So we should become, again, we can't be passive anymore. We can't count on the nightly news to inform us. It will indoctrinate us. We can't count on the comedy shows at 10 o'clock after the news to entertain us. Again, they'll indoctrinate us. So we have to be very thoughtful. We have to shun instruments of influence and gaslighting, and then search out news outlets, writers that write on the topics that interest us, and take advantage of apps that aggregate that information, get it right into your phone, right into your, and then there's things like Epoch Times, which I subscribe to. So Steve Bannon, I'm a big fan of Steve Bannon's podcast. So there's a lot of ways for us to get information.
I think the American people have to remember that they're in charge. It's their hard-earned dollars that support our government. They're paying for all of this, and I think they should know where this money's going. And I think that's one really good area to start with in terms of accountability. Asking your representative, for example, where is my tax money going? How is it being spent? The American people are in charge. It's often not presented like that from the perspective of our government and our elite.
And we're not bumping up against the best and the brightest when we try to exert influence. Just through my little organization and projects that you and I have done together, we can influence the process. We can influence policy. We can influence members of Congress. We can. Sometimes it seems like an impossible cloud. But, if you are the guy in your district that you're a member of Congress, you host a coffee when they're a state rep and support them and they run for Congress, and you build that relationship, and it's relationship building. It's not, and they're going to let you down, and you're going to have disagreements, and you never break that relationship. You always, and you don't talk to them about everything. You're not the guy that calls them about taxes or calls them about the Second Amendment. If you're listening to this show, you're the person that contacts them because you're there to advance the interests of the vulnerable. That's what I see my job is. So you build those relationships, and next thing you know, you're shocked. I have several members of Congress as close friends. I can ask them to give them sample op-eds or things that they can do, or maybe sample legislation, and next thing you know, it's being introduced. These are things that all of us can do because all politics are local. I can't know your congressman. You can, but you can't demand your congressman's respect. We were able to get some friends out of Afghanistan because of a relationship with a member of Congress I had for 30 years. You have to build and maintain these relationships, and you don't look across the country. You look at where you live, and maybe your member of Congress is untouchable and out of reach and ideologically different, maybe in a different party. Then you build a relationship with a state representative, and you help get that person into Congress. And then it might be 12 years later that they can hold a committee hearing that, like something we pulled off about 12 years ago, that leads to the cessation of bombing in the Nuba Mountains in Sudan. This is what we can all do. Every one of us listening can do this. And the first thing we can do right now is just write our members of Congress and say there needs to be accountability for this debacle in Afghanistan. We need an autopsy. We need to know how we got here and who is responsible. We need the truth and we need accountability. That's all we're asking for, because
we footed the bill for this. We paid for it, and they should. And the American people should be mad.
And the good news is, John, they're mad. They're mad.
God bless them.
My COVID pneumonia is about to let loose. Before I interviewed you, I did my best to get all the congestion out, but I can tell I'm about to go into one of these horrible COVID pneumonia coughing fits. I cannot thank you enough for coming on the show. Maybe we can do another show in a couple weeks, and I think you and I are going to have maybe a big announcement soon for folks too. I can't wait to announce that. But
well, my pleasure, and my best to everybody out there, all the great Americans.
All right, guys, let's be clear. John is one of my best friends, and he's the man I respect most in the world. And he's not the type of guy that likes to run out there and do media interviews. So I'm so grateful that he came on to this show. As I said in the beginning, this is a man who not only has disciplined himself to know the languages, who's lived in the region for over 20 years, who's been wounded 3 times, and then now in his career after being an intelligence officer, he's really working to leverage his life, his experience, his abilities to advance the interests of vulnerable communities. I think you heard in this interview a man who has knowledge that has been earned over a lifetime of commitment. First as a young student to languages, then in a life of public service, and a commitment not only to the people of the United States, but to the people we've made promises to. I want this show to be listened to by as many people as possible. And so I'd ask that you share the show, like I did in the beginning, in the intro. Share it with your friends, your family, your members of Congress, influencers that you know. And we'll be doing some more shows like this coming up. I apologize if this interview had to be done. As you can probably hear in my voice, I do have COVID, I have pneumonia, and I'm not feeling the best, but this show could not wait another day. I really wanted to get it out there. And with this podcast that's growing and has an audience all over the world, we are going to fight back against the narratives that are going to be generated as they seek to form public opinion to change how we see what is undeniably a great catastrophe and a national embarrassment. This cannot be swept under the rug. The canary in the coal mine has died, and we, the people, we need now to take responsibility. We need to make sure there is accountability. And we need to make sure that we never make promises like this again that we do not intend to keep. We never go to war again we don't intend to win. And we never behave in such an ignoble, shameful fashion. And so this is the lesson. This is the lesson I hope that we will learn as a country. And I am very hopeful. I am really, as we talked a lot about, it was an almost impossible task to bring media attention to the plight of the Iraqis as ISIS was raging across the country. But the sudden, passionate, spontaneous response of the American people, the shock, has given me hope that the paddles are to the chest and that heart might start beating again. All right, I am on all kinds of medicine, probably talking way too much. Thank you again. This episode is being brought to you by the Vulnerable People Project. Go to thegreatcampaign.org, become a monthly supporter. Also, as always, this show has been brought to you by the MyPillow.com, Mike Lindell's MyPillow. Great products, great guy. Not only does he make a great product, he likes to support shows like this. So I think it's very important that we support Mike Lindell, not because, he's supporting us, although we should do that because he's supporting us, He makes a great pillow, the best pillow. The Giza sheets are the best, and there's specials on all of that. Right now, go to mypillow.com, click on the radio listener square, use the code Jones, get deep discounts and everything. There's a special this month on the Giza Dream Sheets. We say, our mission at the Vulnerable People Project, which sponsors the show, is to be in solidarity with the vulnerable, is to become vulnerable. And that's what we have seen this week in Afghanistan. Our failure to stand with the vulnerable to the point of our vulnerability. There is no solidarity without risk, period. There is no solidarity without risk. And we should be truly, when we make a pledge, when we make a promise, when we tell the vulnerable we will be there with them, we should be there with them till the job is done. Okay? Until next time, I hope I'm feeling better. It's day 22 of COVID, and now the pneumonia swept in. Yay. I hope I'm feeling better. Until next time, it's the Jason Jones Show.
This has been the Jason Jones Show, powered by Mudhouse Media.